I'm Ria, 23, and hospitals have been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. Growing up with a chronic illness meant frequent visits, painful treatments, and more surgeries than I'd like to count. Thankfully, my dad, Nate, who's 48, has been my rock through it all. No matter what I had to go through, he'd always be there for me, keeping me company during those long hospital stays and giving me the strength to keep going. Recently, I had to undergo a particularly intense surgery, and recovery felt like an uphill battle. I was in the hospital for a full 2 weeks. Dad was there almost every single day, but a couple of days before I was set to go home, he had to leave for a work trip. Being a business consultant, he often has to travel across the country, and sometimes it's impossible for him to get out of it. He apologized countless times for not being able to pick me up from the hospital, but I understood. Work is work. Besides, my stepmom, Cara, who's 45, had promised to handle things until he got back. Now, a bit of background on Cara and me. Our relationship has always been rocky, to put it mildly. She came into our lives when I was 16, and from the beginning, things were strained between us. I tried to be polite, even make an effort, but Cara seemed like she was always on edge around me. Over the years, I started to feel like she resented my presence, like I was an inconvenience in her relationship with Dad. And maybe it's silly, but I always thought part of it had to do with the fact that I look a lot like my mom, who passed away when I was just 10. Cara hated that. To her, I was a constant reminder of Dad's life before she came along. But despite all that, I respected Dad's choice. He loved her, and for that reason alone, I tolerated a lot of her actions. So when I finally got home from the hospital, I was exhausted but relieved. I remember walking into my room feeling this immense sense of relief to be back. I threw myself onto my bed and immediately fell asleep. When I woke up a few hours later, I figured I'd tidy up my room a bit just to settle back in. But as I started moving things around, I noticed something wasn't right. My room looked empty, in a way that made my stomach drop. It didn't take me long to realize that a lot of my things were missing, and not just random things either, everything that had belonged to my mom. My heart started racing as I frantically searched every corner of my room, thinking maybe I'd somehow misplaced them or that someone had moved them. I felt weak from my surgery, barely able to stand, but I was desperate. I checked every drawer, every shelf. It quickly became clear, everything that had once belonged to my mom, things I'd held onto for years, was gone. Her old jewelry box, her letters to me, her framed photos, every single one of those precious memories was just gone. In a panic, I checked our storage closet, where we kept some of Mom's other belongings, things like her clothes and a few family heirlooms. It was completely empty. My hands were shaking. I could barely breathe. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I went straight to Cara, trying to keep myself calm. I asked her if she'd moved anything from my room, hoping she'd tell me she'd just relocated them, but instead, she just gave me this smug smile, like she'd been waiting for me to ask. Casually, as if it meant nothing, she said she had taken care of my things and that I didn't need to worry about any of it anymore. That's when I felt something inside me break. I pressed her for more details, trying to stay calm, hoping this was all some horrible misunderstanding. But her smug look only grew, and finally she admitted it. She had burned everything. I just stood there, completely numb. It felt like my world had shattered all over again. I asked her, my voice barely a whisper, "Why? Why would you do that?" Cara looked at me, utterly unfazed, and told me she was doing Dad a favor, that he needed to let go of his past. She said those memories only served to hold him back, that it was time for him to move on. I was furious. I told her she'd made a huge mistake and that Dad would never be okay with what she'd done. But she just laughed, saying she knew him better than I did and that he'd be grateful she'd cleared out everything that was tying him down. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My head was spinning and I couldn't think straight. I felt like I was going to be sick. This was more than just stuff. These were pieces of my mom, pieces of my childhood. They were all I had left of her, and now, thanks to Cara, they were gone. I turned and stumbled back to my room, trying to hold myself together, but as soon as I closed the door, I broke down. I cried for what felt like hours, letting out all the pain and anger that had built up inside me. It was like losing my mom all over again. The last bits of her, the things she'd left me, were gone, and Cara had taken them from me out of sheer spite. I knew she didn't like me, but I never thought she'd do something so heartless. After a while, I pulled myself together enough to call my dad. I needed him to know what had happened, but he was in the middle of a meeting. When he finally picked up, he sounded distracted and busy. I tried to tell him what Cara had done, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. He just muttered something about dealing with it when he got back home and hung up. I was crushed. I needed him to understand how much this hurt, but he was a million miles away, and I was alone in that house, stuck with Cara. The next few days were pure agony. I felt so isolated, so helpless. Every time Cara saw me, she made a point to remind me of what she'd done. She kept telling me it was time to grow up and stop obsessing over my mom. She said I was childish for holding on to things that were just junk. She'd sneer at me every chance she got, reveling in my misery, and there was nothing I could do but wait for Dad to come home. When Dad finally got back, I was ready. I'd rehearsed everything I wanted to tell him over and over in my head. As soon as he walked in, I sat him down and laid it all out. I told him everything that had happened, from the moment I'd stepped into my empty room to Cara's smug confession. At first, he looked like he didn't believe me. He kept saying there must be some kind of mistake, or that Cara was just joking around, but I took him to my room and then to the storage closet. I watched his face as he realized that everything was truly gone. He went pale. I could see the shock and devastation wash over him. Mom had been the love of his life. They'd met when they were kids, grew up together, and built a life together. Even though he'd moved on and married Cara, those things were irreplaceable pieces of his past with her. And now they were gone. Dad confronted Cara immediately. She tried to brush it off, saying it was no big deal, that I was just trying to manipulate him, but I could see the anger boiling inside him. He told her right there and then that he wanted a divorce. Cara's smugness disappeared in an instant. She tried to argue, saying it was her house too and that he couldn't just kick her out. But he reminded her that he'd owned the house long before they'd met. He told her she had 24 hours to pack her things and leave, or he'd have his lawyer handle it. That was the last straw. Cara stormed out of the house in a fit of rage, but Dad and I barely noticed. We were both too heartbroken, too lost in our grief over what she'd done. That night, we mourned together. We sat up for hours talking about Mom, sharing memories, and grieving the pieces of her that Cara had destroyed. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly close to my dad, and I could tell he was feeling the same way. The next day, Dad made a decision. He was done letting Cara walk all over us. He called his lawyer and told him everything, including the destruction of my mom's belongings. He decided to file a lawsuit against her, not just for the emotional toll, but also for the physical destruction of priceless items. He wanted her to face the consequences of her actions. Cara, of course, was furious. She tried to twist the story, saying I'd manipulated Dad and that this was all my fault, but Dad wasn't having it. He was done with her lies and manipulation. I felt a mix of emotions, sadness, anger, relief, but mostly I felt a sense of justice. Cara had taken everything I had left of my mom, but now she was finally going to be held accountable. Once Dad filed the lawsuit, things moved faster than I expected. Cara was blindsided. I don't think she ever imagined that Dad would stand up to her like this. She kept trying to call him, begging him to talk things out, but he ignored every message. Her attitude had shifted from smug confidence to complete panic. She even tried reaching out to me, sending desperate texts about how I was ruining her life. It was honestly surreal to watch. It turned out that Cara hadn't just destroyed sentimental items. Some of the things she'd burned had significant financial value. My mom's family had passed down a few antiques, a vintage watch, some rare jewelry, that were worth thousands. They'd all been carefully preserved, insured even, because they'd been in the family for generations. Mom had entrusted those to me, and now they were gone. When Dad realized the true financial weight of what Cara had done, it only fueled his anger. This wasn't just emotional damage, it was serious property destruction, and with insurance on those items, the case against her only got stronger. Cara was livid. She refused to take any responsibility, claiming she'd only done it to help Dad move on. But with the evidence piling up, she was running out of excuses. The insurance company even got involved. Since Dad had filed a claim, they launched their own investigation and were fully on his side. Now, Cara wasn't just facing Dad's lawsuit, she was looking at financial responsibility for everything she'd destroyed, with no way to talk her way out of it. To make things worse for her, Dad had insisted on a prenuptial agreement when they'd married. It meant that she wouldn't be walking away with anything beyond what she'd brought into the marriage, which wasn't much. At first, she tried to challenge it, but her own lawyer told her she didn't have a case. Dad's assets, the house, his money, it would all stay with him. Cara's world was crumbling, and she knew it. She was spiraling, sending me endless texts, each one more bitter than the last. She kept accusing me of manipulating Dad, saying that if I hadn't poisoned his mind, none of this would be happening. In her eyes, she was the victim, and I was to blame for everything. But I was done with her games. I'd spent years tolerating her because I loved my dad and wanted to keep the peace. But that time was over. She'd crossed a line, and I wasn't going to feel guilty for standing up for what was right. As the lawsuit dragged on, Cara's life continued to unravel. She'd always been obsessed with appearances, hosting fancy dinners, and flaunting her lifestyle. But now, people were starting to distance themselves from her. Mutual friends of hers and Dad's found out about the lawsuit, about what she'd done, and they weren't buying her excuses. Suddenly, she wasn't the polished socialite she liked to portray. She was the woman who'd destroyed her husband's memories and violated her family's trust. It didn't take long for people to start seeing her for who she really was. Dad, meanwhile, was holding up remarkably well. I could see the pain in his eyes every time he thought about what she'd done, but he was determined to see this through. He wasn't the kind of person to hold grudges, but this was different. He was hurt. Not just for himself, but for me and for the memories of Mom that Cara had destroyed. He poured his energy into the case, determined to make her pay for everything she'd taken from us. The financial hit was already starting to catch up with Cara. She lost her car, it had been leased through Dad's company, and he canceled it the day the divorce papers were filed. She complained endlessly about having to take public transportation, saying it was humiliating, but neither of us felt sorry for her. She was the one who'd chosen to destroy everything, and now she was facing the consequences. From what I'd heard, she was struggling to find a new place to live, with the prenup blocking her from getting any of Dad's assets and the lawsuit draining her resources. She couldn't afford to keep up the lifestyle she'd been so proud of. But she refused to settle for anything less than the best. She begged Dad to let her stay in the house, just until she got back on her feet, but he shut that down immediately. Cara was out of options, and it was starting to show. As satisfying as it was to see her finally face the consequences of her actions, it was also exhausting. Every day she'd find a way to reach out, to try and guilt me, to blame me for her downfall. She told anyone who would listen that I'd ruined her life by holding on to the past, but I knew that the truth was catching up to her. She couldn't hide behind her lies anymore, and it was clear that her world was falling apart. Watching all of this unfold brought me a strange sense of relief. I'd spent years walking on eggshells around her, trying to keep the peace for Dad's sake, but now there was no peace left to keep. She'd made her choices, and she was paying for them. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like justice was being served. As the legal proceedings continued, things took an unexpected turn. During the discovery phase of the lawsuit, when both sides are required to provide all relevant information, Dad's lawyer found something big. It turns out that Cara had been siphoning money from Dad's business accounts for years. She'd had access to some of the finances for household expenses, and Dad, trusting her, never questioned it. But the records showed that she'd been withdrawing thousands here and there, spending it all on luxury items and lavish getaways, all while pretending to be this supportive wife. When Dad learned about this, he was beyond furious. If he'd been hurt by the destruction of Mom's belongings, this was a whole new level of betrayal. She hadn't just crossed a line, she'd trampled right over it. Dad's lawyer advised him to press full-on fraud charges, and he didn't hesitate. He wanted her to face the consequences of every single thing she'd done. Cara's lawyer scrambled to negotiate a settlement, hoping to avoid a full trial, but Dad wouldn't even consider it. He was done giving her the benefit of the doubt. He wanted her to feel the weight of her actions, and this was the only way to make sure that happened. As the evidence stacked up, Cara's situation grew more and more hopeless. This wasn't just about emotional damage or property destruction anymore. She was facing a fraud case with undeniable proof. And fraud isn't a light charge. Embezzling money from her own husband's business? It was serious, and the legal team was determined to make it stick. Every piece of evidence they found only painted a clearer picture of how far she'd gone to fund her lifestyle. I still remember the day Dad sat me down to tell me what they'd uncovered. Part of me wasn't surprised. I'd always known she was selfish and manipulative, but this was on a different scale. She'd played the role of the perfect wife, all while slowly draining Dad's business for her own gain. The thought made me sick. Of course, she didn't see it that way. Even as the case built against her, she kept reaching out to me, saying that I was to blame for all of this. According to her, if I hadn't poisoned Dad against her, she wouldn't be in this mess. I'd gotten used to her twisted perspective by then, but it still amazed me how she could twist the truth and see herself as the victim. She couldn't accept any responsibility even now. Meanwhile, Dad's legal team was relentless. They kept finding more evidence, more proof of her betrayal, and each new discovery made the case stronger. By this point, Dad and I were both exhausted, but seeing her face the consequences was giving us a sense of closure. The relief that came with knowing she couldn't just walk away was worth every grueling hour we spent in court. It's hard to describe the satisfaction I felt watching her fall from the high pedestal she'd built for herself. Her entire life was crumbling, and there was no one left to blame but herself. Her friends had distanced themselves, her reputation was shattered, and now she was facing the very real possibility of jail time. All the lies, all the deceit, it was catching up to her in a way that even she couldn't deny. At one point, she tried to make a last-ditch attempt to negotiate. She begged Dad to drop the charges, saying that she'd return whatever money she had left. But Dad was unmoved. She'd burned every bridge, and he wasn't about to let her get away with everything she'd done. His mind was made up, and he wanted justice. Seeing her face, the reality of her actions brought me a strange sense of peace. I'd spent so many years feeling trapped by her presence, by her constant need to belittle me and to make me feel small. But now, it was all out in the open, and she couldn't hide from the truth anymore. And for the first time, I felt like I could finally start to heal. Months went by as the legal case against Cara slowly played out. Dad and I had moments where the weight of it all felt almost too much to carry, but we kept pushing forward. Every day brought us closer to the resolution we needed. And then, finally, the day came when the court handed down its verdict. The judge ruled in Dad's favor on all counts. Every charge stuck. Cara was ordered to pay back every cent she'd taken from Dad's business, and on top of that, she was hit with additional damages for destroying Mom's belongings. The total amount was staggering, enough to leave her financially ruined. Gone were her designer bags, luxury vacations, fancy cars, everything she'd built her image on. Cara's life of comfort and privilege had come crashing down, and there was no one left to blame but herself. The divorce finalized around the same time. In one last-ditch effort, Cara tried to spin a story, claiming that Dad had emotionally mistreated her and that she'd only taken money to survive. But Dad's lawyer was prepared. They had evidence, piles of receipts showing how she'd spent the money on vacations, spa treatments, and designer clothes. The judge saw right through her. Instead of winning her sympathy, her claim backfired. It only served to paint a clearer picture of her greed and deceit. Cara had also been charged with fraud for the money she'd embezzled. Although she managed to avoid jail time through a plea deal, she was placed on probation, and she'd be under court supervision for years to come. The financial restitution she owed would haunt her for a long time, leaving her with little chance of ever recovering her old lifestyle. Her reputation was gone, tarnished beyond repair. Her story even made it into the local news. Her image as a wealthy, sophisticated socialite shattered for everyone to see. Now, everyone knew the truth. I thought that would be the end of it. But even after the court ruling, Cara wouldn't leave me alone. She still sent me bitter, angry messages, blaming me for her downfall. In her mind, I was the reason her life was in shambles. She kept saying that if I hadn't interfered, everything would have been fine. But I'd stopped caring about her twisted view of reality. Her texts were just empty words to me now, and I learned to ignore them. Meanwhile, Dad and I were slowly picking up the pieces. The house felt different, almost lighter without her presence hanging over us. I could see Dad starting to heal, even as he grappled with the loss of Mom's things. We talked about her often, sharing memories and keeping her spirit alive in small ways. It didn't bring back what we'd lost, but it brought us closer, and that was a gift in itself. As for me, I was learning to let go of the anger and pain that had consumed me. It hadn't been easy, but seeing Cara face justice had given me a sense of closure I didn't realize I needed. I was finally free to remember my mom without the constant shadow of resentment and loss. There were still days when it hurt to think about everything that had happened, but those days were fewer, and each one that passed felt like a step forward. After months of chaos, life was finally settling back into something close to normal. Dad and I were moving on, each in our own way. The house was our own again, and even though Mom's belongings were gone, her memory was everywhere, in the stories we told, the traditions we kept, and the quiet moments we shared. Thank you to everyone who followed along with this story for your kind words and encouragement through the darkest times. It's meant more to me than I can put into words. I'm closing this chapter of my life for good, and I finally feel ready to move forward, carrying my mom's memory with me in peace.